The accent that taught a lesson. The Auburn University campus buzzed with activity on that warm September morning. The century-old oak trees were beginning to show hints of golden hues, and the air carried that distinctive scent of southern autumn, a mixture of freshly cut grass and the promise of cooler days ahead. In the education department's conference hall, about 200 students were settling into their seats, chatting animatedly. It was the annual Leaders and Lessons event, where local personalities were invited to share experiences with future educators. Marcus Williams, 22 years old, a native of Boston and graduate student in pedagogy, stood out among his Southern classmates. Son of university professors, he had always considered himself intellectually superior, especially regarding what he called the backwoods culture of the South. Seated in the third row, he constantly adjusted his square-framed glasses while typing notes on his latest model laptop. "Who do y'all think is speaking today?" asked Jessica, a classmate born and raised in Alabama, sitting beside him. Marcus didn't even look up from his screen. "I hope it's someone minimally articulate. Last year it was that farmer who could barely form a complete sentence." Jessica frowned. "Mr. Henderson owns one of the largest agricultural cooperatives in the state and has 2 master's degrees. Just because he has an accent doesn't mean—" "Please," Marcus interrupted with a condescending smile. "An accent is one thing. Intelligence is something completely different." At that moment, Professor Dr. Sarah Mitchell entered the room, accompanied by a tall man with broad shoulders and graying hair. He wore a well-tailored navy blue suit, but his casual posture and warm smile revealed someone comfortable in any environment. "Students, I'd like to introduce today's guest," announced Dr. Mitchell. "Tommy Tuberville, former football coach and current senator from Alabama." A murmur of recognition swept through the room. Tuberville was a legend in the state, known not only for his athletic achievements, but also for his successful transition into politics. Marcus, however, rolled his eyes discreetly. "Great," he muttered to Jessica, "an ex-football coach. I bet he's going to talk about teamwork and never giving up with that thick accent." Tuberville approached the podium with confident steps. As he adjusted the microphone, his voice echoed through the room with that unmistakable Alabama drawl, the elongated vowels, the measured rhythm that marked each word. "Good morning, folks. It's a pleasure to be here with y'all today." Marcus could barely contain a snicker, whispering loud enough for some classmates to hear. "Here we go. It's a pleasure to be here with y'all today." He exaggerated the accent mockingly, drawing some nervous laughter from nearby students. What Marcus didn't realize was that his imitation had been heard not only by his classmates, but also by Tuberville himself, whose ears, trained by years commanding teams in noisy stadiums, caught the mocking comment perfectly. Tuberville paused almost imperceptibly, his eyes quickly scanning the audience, until they found the young man with glasses in the third row. But instead of showing irritation, an almost paternal smile formed on his lips. "Before I begin," he said, his voice maintaining the same warm tone, "I'd like to tell a little story. When I was about y'all's age, I also thought I knew everything about people just by how they talked." The silence in the room became absolute. Marcus felt his stomach tighten, realizing he had been caught. "I grew up in a small town in Arkansas where everybody talked just like me," continued Tuberville, walking casually closer to the audience. "When I got to college, I met a young man from New York. Smart fellow, always had the best grades, and he made a point of imitating our way of speaking, thinking it made him superior." Marcus swallowed hard. He felt all eyes converging on him. "Y'all know what happened to him?" Tuberville asked, making a dramatic pause. "He spent 4 years missing opportunities because he was too busy judging people by the surface to see what really mattered." The tension in the room was palpable. Jessica shot a warning look at Marcus, who was now squirming uncomfortably in his chair. "But that's a story for later," said Tuberville with an enigmatic smile. "First, Let me tell you about a lesson I learned when I was still coaching. And so began one of the most memorable lectures in the university's history, one that would change not only Marcus's perspective on hasty judgments, but also become a landmark in education about respect and cultural diversity. Tommy Tuberville returned to the podium, his hands resting casually on the wooden lectern. The morning light streaming through the large windows created an almost theatrical atmosphere, illuminating his face as he carefully observed each student. "You know," he began, "when I became head coach at Ole Miss, I was 29 years old and thought I knew everything about leadership. I had studied all the manuals, watched hours of game footage, memorized strategies from the best coaches in the country." Marcus still felt uncomfortable, but couldn't help paying attention. There was something about Tuberville's presence that commanded respect, regardless of the accent. "My first big game was against Auburn University. Ironically, the same university where I would later have some of the best years of my career. We were losing by 14 points at halftime, and I was desperate." Tuberville began walking across the front of the room, his steps measured and confident. "In the locker room, I was ready to give one of those motivational speeches you see in movies, you know? Yell, beat my chest, talk about honor and glory. But when I looked at my players, I saw something that stopped me in my tracks." He paused, his eyes briefly meeting Marcus's before continuing. "There was a kid, Jamal Thompson, sitting alone in the corner, son of a family of rural workers from Mississippi. He had earned a scholarship not just for his football talent, but also for his excellent grades. But at that moment he was looking down, and I could hear some teammates whispering." The room was in absolute silence. Even the students who had initially laughed at Marcus's imitation were now paying full attention. "What did he say?" Tuberville imitated the voices, slightly changing his tone. "I didn't understand anything with that thick accent. How's he going to communicate with the defense if we can't even understand what he's saying?" Jessica glanced discreetly at Marcus, who had stopped typing completely and was now staring at Tuberville with a serious expression. "At that moment," continued Tuberville, "I had two choices. I could ignore the situation and focus only on game strategy, or I could do something that would change not just that game, but my entire philosophy as a leader." He moved closer to the audience, his voice gaining special intensity. "I called Jamal to the center of the locker room, asked him to explain the defensive play we had trained all week. And you know what happened?" Tuberville smiled, a special gleam in his eyes. That boy, with his thick accent, explained not just the play, but identified 3 flaws in our strategy that I, with all my formal education and coaching manuals, hadn't noticed. He had observed the opposing team's patterns, analyzed player tendencies, and formulated a counter-strategy that was pure genius. Dr. Mitchell, watching from the side of the room, smiled discreetly. She knew exactly where Tuberville was heading with this story. "More important than that," he continued, "while Jamal explained, I saw respect growing in the other players' eyes. Not because he had changed his way of speaking, but because they were finally listening to what he really had to say." Marcus felt a knot in his throat. The story echoed uncomfortably with his own attitude just minutes before. "We implemented Jamal's suggestions in the second half. We didn't just win that game 21-17, but that victory became the turning point for one of the best seasons of my early career. And all because I learned to listen beyond the accent, beyond first impressions, beyond my own prejudices." Tuberville returned to the podium, but this time leaned against it more intimately, as if having a private conversation with each student. Jamal Thompson, by the way, graduated summa cum laude in engineering, played 4 years in the NFL, and today is one of NASA's chief engineers. Still speaks with the same Mississippi accent. Still the smartest person I know. The silence in the room was almost reverent. Marcus felt his hands trembling and heat rising up his face. "Now," said Tuberville, his tone becoming more direct, "I know some of y'all might be thinking, that's a nice story, coach, but what does this have to do with education?" He paused, allowing the question to hang in the air. "It has everything to do with it, because y'all are going to be teachers. You're going to have students from all corners of this country and the world. Students with different accents, different backgrounds, different ways of expressing their intelligence. And if y'all make the same mistake I almost made, you're going to miss the opportunity to discover some of the brightest minds that ever walked through your classroom doors." Marcus lowered his head, feeling the weight of the words. Beside him, Jessica gave him a gentle pat on the shoulder, a gesture of silent support. "So before we continue," said Tuberville, "I'd like to ask a direct question to the young man in the third row who had the courage to express his opinion about my accent right at the beginning." All eyes turned to Marcus, who felt as if the ground would open beneath his feet. But there was something in Tuberville's tone. It wasn't accusatory or hostile. It was paternal. "Son, could you stand up for a moment?" Marcus felt every fiber of his body protest against the movement, but something in Tuberville's voice, a mixture of firmness and gentleness he had never experienced before, made him slowly rise from his chair. His legs trembled slightly, and he could feel the heat of 200 pairs of eyes upon him. "What's your name, son?" asked Tuberville, his voice echoing through the room's sound system. "Marcus Williams, sir," he stammered, his own voice sounding strange and distant in his ears. "Where are you from, Marcus?" "Boston, Massachusetts." Tuberville nodded slowly, as if processing the information. "And tell me, Marcus, what brought you to Auburn to study education?" The question caught Marcus off guard. He had expected a reprimand, maybe even to be expelled from the lecture. Instead, Tuberville seemed genuinely interested in his answer. Well, my parents are university professors. They always encouraged me to pursue academic excellence, and I wanted to make a difference in education," he replied, his voice gaining a bit more firmness. "Make a difference," repeated Tuberville, savoring the words. "That's noble, Marcus, really noble. And tell me something, your parents, do they have Boston accents?" Marcus blinked, confused by the direction of the question. "Yes, sir. I mean, to me it's normal, but yes." "And do you consider your parents intelligent people?" "Extremely intelligent, sir. My father has a doctorate in English literature from Harvard, and my mother is a PhD in educational psychology from MIT. A murmur of impressions swept through the room. Tuberville smiled slightly. "Impressive credentials. Now tell me, Marcus, if I went to Boston to give a lecture and imitated your parents' accent the way you imitated mine, how would you feel?" The question fell like a hammer. Marcus felt his stomach drop and his face burn with shame. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. "You don't need to answer now," said Tuberville gently, "but I want you to think about it. Because what you did today wasn't just disrespecting me. It was disrespecting an entire culture, an entire region of this country, and potentially all the future students you'll have who speak differently than you do." Jessica, beside Marcus's empty chair, felt tears forming in her eyes. She had grown up hearing similar comments about her own southern accent during her exchange years in the North. "Marcus," continued Tuberville, "you mentioned wanting to make a difference in education. Let me tell you something about making a difference." He began walking again, but this time toward Marcus, stopping a few feet from him. "In 1999, when I was coaching Auburn, we had a kid named Ron DeBarber on our team. Excellent player, but he had academic difficulties. Not because he was stupid, far from it, but because he came from a different background, spoke in a way that some professors considered inappropriate for the university environment. The room was absolutely silent, every word from Tuberville echoing clearly. There was a professor, I won't mention names, who constantly corrected how Rhonda spoke during classes. That's not how you say it. You need to learn to express yourself properly. How do you expect to be taken seriously speaking like that? Marcus felt as if every word was directed straight at him. You know what happened? Ron stopped participating in class discussions. One of the most insightful young men I've ever known became silent, insecure, doubting his own intelligence because of how he spoke. Tuberville paused, letting the impact of the story settle. It took the intervention of another professor, a wise woman named Dr. Betty Johnson, to reverse the damage. She not only valued Ron's contributions regardless of how he expressed himself, but also helped the entire class understand that intelligence manifests in different ways. Dr. Mitchell, observing from the side, remembered similar cases in her own career and nodded almost imperceptibly. Ron graduated with honors, had a successful NFL career, and today is a sports commentator and businessman. But he told me years later that he almost dropped out of university because of those constant corrections that made him feel like he wasn't good enough. Tuberville turned his attention completely to Marcus. Now, Marcus, imagine you're that young man's teacher. Imagine you have the power to make him feel valued or diminished. What choice would you make? Marcus swallowed hard. His mind raced, reviewing not just the moment of imitation, but years of similar attitudes, jokes about accents, assumptions about intelligence based on how people spoke, condescending comments about country folk. I wish I could go back and not have made that imitation, sir, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But you can do something better than going back, Marcus, replied Tuberville. You can learn from it. You can use this moment as a turning point in your journey as an educator. He moved closer, his voice taking on a more personal tone. I'll tell you a secret, son. I wasn't born talking like this. I worked for years to soften my accent when I was younger, thinking it would make people take me more seriously. I spent energy and time trying to be someone I wasn't, instead of focusing on what really mattered, being competent, compassionate, and having integrity. Marcus raised his eyes, meeting Tuberville's direct gaze for the first time. So when I finally accepted who I was, accent and all, that's when I really started to succeed, because I stopped wasting energy trying to impress people with a fake version of myself and started concentrating on being the best version of the person I really am. The transformation in Marcus's face was visible. The defensive arrogance had disappeared, replaced by something that seemed like genuine understanding. Marcus, you have the potential to be a great educator. I can see it in your passion, even if it was misdirected today. But you need to decide. Are you going to be the kind of teacher who judges by the surface? Or are you going to be the one who seeks potential in every student, regardless of how they express themselves? It was a rhetorical question, but Marcus felt the weight of the choice being offered to him. It wasn't just about accents or regional prejudices, it was about the kind of person he wanted to be. Marcus remained standing, feeling the weight of the moment. The entire room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for his response. But Tuberville, sensing the young man's internal struggle, decided to share something that would make the lesson even more powerful. Have a seat, Marcus, he said gently. There's something else I need to share with y'all, something few people know about my journey. Marcus sat down slowly, feeling both relieved and anxious about what would come next. When I was 8 years old, began Tuberville, his voice taking on a more intimate tone, my family temporarily moved to Connecticut because of my father's work. It was my first experience outside the South, and it was brutal. He walked to the window, briefly looking out at the campus before turning back to the students. On the first day of school, when I introduced myself to the class, there was laughter. Not discreet giggles, but open guffaws. The teacher had to ask for silence several times. A girl named Jennifer turned to me and said, loud enough for the whole class to hear, "Where did you come from? The last century?" Jessica held her breath. She had never imagined that someone like Tuberville, so confident and successful, could have gone through something like that. For weeks, I barely spoke at school. When I had to read aloud, my voice got so low that the teacher constantly asked me to speak louder, which only intensified attention on my accent. Marcus felt a knot growing in his throat. The story echoed disturbingly with his own attitude minutes before. My parents noticed I was changing. At home, I tried to imitate the accents I heard on TV, practicing in the mirror to sound more normal. My mother found me doing this one night and sat down with me for a conversation that changed my life. Tuberville returned to the center of the room, his presence commanding absolute attention. She told me, "Tommy, your voice carries the history of our family, our land, our people. When you try to change it to please others, you're denying all of that. Be proud of who you are and force the world to respect you not despite your origin, but because of who that origin made you become." Dr. Mitchell felt tears forming in her eyes. As an educator, she had seen many students struggling with similar issues of identity and acceptance. But the real lesson came a few weeks later, continued Tuberville. There was a boy in my class named David Chen, son of Chinese immigrants. English wasn't his first language yet. And guess who was the favorite target of the same kids who mocked me? Marcus closed his eyes, anticipating where the story would lead. One day during recess, I saw David being surrounded by a group of boys, including some who used to imitate my accent. They were repeating his words in an exaggerated way, making faces, laughing cruelly. The tension in the room was palpable. Each student seemed to be reliving their own memories of bullying or witnessing similar situations. "And I, Marcus," said Tuberville, addressing the young man directly, "I stood there. For one horrible and shameful moment, I felt relief that I wasn't the target. I was so focused on protecting myself that I almost ignored another child's suffering." Marcus opened his eyes, meeting Tuberville's penetrating gaze. Almost, because at that moment, I heard my mother's voice echoing in my mind. If I was proud of who I was, then I needed to defend not just my right to be different, but everyone's right to be different. Tuberville paused, letting the gravity of the moment settle. I walked up to the group and said, with my Arkansas accent real thick, "If y'all want to make fun of someone for talking different, make fun of me too, because apparently neither of us talks the right way for you folks." A small but proud smile formed on Tuberville's lips. You know what happened? David and I became close friends. He helped me with math, I helped him with American history. We discovered we both had a passion for strategy, me through sports, him through chess, and when others tried to put us down, we defended each other. Jessica looked at Marcus, seeing silent tears streaming down his face. David Chen, by the way, became one of Silicon Valley's leading software engineers. We still talk regularly. And yes, he still has his unique accent, a beautiful mixture of Chinese and American English that reflects exactly who he is. Tuberville turned his attention to the entire room. The reason I tell this story isn't to humiliate anyone, but to illustrate a crucial point. We all have prejudices. We've all judged someone by the surface. The question isn't whether we've done this, but what we do when we realize we're wrong. He walked slowly across the front of the room, making eye contact with various students. As educators, y'all will have the power to shape how children see themselves and see others. You can be like that professor who constantly corrected Rhonda Barber, focusing on differences as deficiencies, or you can be like Dr. Betty Johnson, who saw differences as strengths. Marcus finally found his voice, still trembling but determined. "Mr. Tuberville," he said, standing up again, "I would like to apologize publicly, not just for the imitation, but for the attitude behind it. I behaved exactly like those boys in Connecticut, and that's not who I want to be as a person or as a future educator." The raw honesty in Marcus's voice echoed through the room. Tuberville nodded respectfully. "Marcus, I accept your apology. More importantly, I hope you accept this moment as a gift, the opportunity to grow and become not just a better educator, but a better person. What none of those present knew was that this exchange was being recorded by the university's camera for educational archives, and that this recording in the years that followed would become one of the most powerful teaching tools about respect, diversity, and personal growth ever created. 5 years after that transformative day at Auburn, the recording of Tommy Tuberville's lecture had traveled an extraordinary path. What began as an educational archive at the university had become a viral phenomenon that changed lives across the country. Marcus Williams, now 27 years old, was in his own classroom at Martin Luther King Jr. Elementary School in Birmingham, Alabama. Yes, he had chosen to stay in the South, a decision his parents initially questioned, but now completely understood. It was an October morning, and Marcus was preparing his 5th grade class for a special activity. His students came from diverse backgrounds: children of NASA engineers, kids from rural families, recent immigrants, Native Americans from the local Creek tribe. "Mr. Williams?" asked Aisha, a 10-year-old girl whose parents had emigrated from Nigeria. "Why are you showing us this video today?" Marcus smiled, remembering how Tuberville had answered questions with patience and wisdom. "Because, Aisha, we're starting our project on cultural diversity, and I want you all to understand something important. Each of you brings something unique and valuable to our classroom." He pointed to the interactive screen where the famous recording was paused at the moment when he himself stands up to apologize. "The young man in this video is me," said Marcus calmly, watching his students' eyes widen in surprise. "And this was the most important lesson I ever learned about respect and humility." Tommy Jr., son of a farming family from the rural county, raised his hand timidly. "Mr. Williams, did you really do that? Make fun of how the senator talks?" "I did, Tommy. And it was one of the worst decisions I ever made, but it also became the moment that changed who I am as a person and as a teacher." During the next hour, Marcus guided his students through a deep discussion about prejudices, first impressions, and the importance of listening beyond superficial differences. The conversation was rich and surprising. The children shared their own experiences of being judged or having judged others. "My grandmother speaks Spanish with a really thick accent," shared Sophia. "Sometimes people talk to her like she's dumb, but she was a teacher in Mexico and knows 3 languages. My dad grew up on a reservation," said Creek Joe. "People always think he didn't study, but he has 2 college degrees." Marcus felt his heart warm as he watched his children making the connections that had taken him years to understand. Meanwhile, 1,600 miles away, in a classroom at PS 234 in the Bronx, New York, teacher Carmen Rodriguez was using the same video with her high school class. "This video went viral 3 years ago," she explained to her students, "and since then, it's been used in more than 2,000 schools across the country, not just to teach about accents and regional prejudices, but about something much bigger." A student raised his hand. "Teacher, why is this video so special? I mean, it's just a guy apologizing." Carmen paused the recording at the moment when Tuberville looks directly at Marcus with compassion instead of anger. "It's special, Carlos, because it shows real transformation, both from Mr. Tuberville, who could have publicly humiliated a student but chose to teach with kindness, and from Marcus Williams, who had the courage to publicly acknowledge his mistake and grow from it." Back in Alabama, Marcus was finishing his class when his phone vibrated with a message. It was from Jessica, his former Auburn classmate, now a school principal in Montgomery. "Marcus, did you see? The video passed 10 million views on educational YouTube, and there's more. Senator Tuberville has been invited to give the keynote speech at the National Educators Conference next month. He specifically asked for you to be there." Marcus smiled, remembering how, 2 years after the original lecture, He had written a letter to Tuberville telling him about his journey as an educator and how that lesson had shaped his work. To his surprise, Tuberville had responded, and since then they maintained occasional correspondence. In the Senate office in Washington, D.C., and Tommy Tuberville was reviewing his schedule with his chief of staff, Linda Chen. Yes, the youngest daughter of David Chen, his friend from his Connecticut school days. "Senator," said Linda, "we received 47 more requests this week from schools wanting you to visit to speak about tolerance and respect. That's already more than 300 requests this year." Tuberville shook his head, still impressed by the reach that impromptu lecture had achieved. "You know, Linda, when I woke up that morning in Auburn 5 years ago, I just wanted to talk to college students about leadership. I never imagined that a teaching moment would become all this." "It's because it was authentic, Senator," replied Linda. "People recognize truth when they see it, and the way you handled that situation, with firmness but without cruelty, with correction but with compassion, that resonates with educators everywhere." Tuberville leaned back in his chair, thinking about the unexpected impact of that day. "You know what impresses me most? It's that Marcus Williams became one of the best examples of personal growth I've ever seen. He could have gotten angry, defensive, or just let the situation pass. Instead, he really changed." 3 weeks later, during the National Educators Conference in Chicago, Marcus was backstage at the main auditorium, nervously adjusting his tie. He had been invited to share the stage with Tuberville, telling his perspective of the experience. "Nervous?" asked a familiar voice. Marcus turned to see Tuberville approaching, still with that warm smile he remembered from the first time. "Terrified," Marcus admitted honestly. "Speaking to 3,000 educators about the worst moment of my life wasn't exactly what I planned when I entered the profession." Tuberville laughed, placing a paternal hand on the young man's shoulder. "Marcus, you already did the hard part 5 years ago. Today is just sharing what you learned, and remember, you're not alone up there." When the time came, the two men walked together onto the stage, received by a standing ovation. The story they told that night, Tuberville with his mentor's perspective, Marcus with his growth journey, became legendary in educational circles. "What I learned," said Marcus to the silent audience, "is that humility isn't about diminishing yourself. It's about being willing to grow, even when it means admitting you were wrong in front of 200 people." Tuberville nodded. "And what I learned is that teaching moments can appear when we least expect them. Our responsibility as leaders, as educators, as human beings, is to recognize those moments and use them to build bridges instead of walls." After the conference, while walking through the hotel lobby, Tuberville shared something that had been on his mind for years. "Marcus, can I tell you something I've never said publicly?" Marcus stopped, intrigued. "When I heard your imitation that day at Auburn, my first reaction was anger. For a moment I wanted to humiliate you, make you feel small like I felt when I was a child. But then I remembered the lesson I learned with David Chen, that when we respond to prejudice with more prejudice, the cycle never breaks." Marcus remained silent, processing the vulnerability that Tuberville was sharing. "So, thank you," continued Tuberville, "for having the courage to grow, for becoming a living example that people can change, and for reminding me why I chose the path of education instead of retaliation." Today, 7 years after that fateful morning in Auburn, the Tuberville-Williams moment, as it became known academically, is studied in education, social psychology, and leadership courses at universities worldwide. The video has been translated into 23 languages and adapted for different cultural contexts. Marcus Williams, now principal of the school where he started as a teacher, implemented a program called Second Chances and First Impressions that teaches students about implicit biases and personal growth. The program has been adopted by more than 500 schools in 15 states. Tommy Tuberville continues his work in the Senate, but dedicates significant time to education about diversity and respect. His autobiography, The Accent of Character: Lessons on Leadership and Acceptance, became a national bestseller, with all royalties donated to educational programs in underserved communities. And in a small rural school in Alabama, a young teacher named Sarah is about to show the now famous video to her class, continuing a cycle of teaching that has spread far beyond what anyone could have imagined on that September morning, when an arrogant student mocked an accent and discovered that some of life's most powerful lessons come from moments when we're forced to confront our own prejudices. The true beauty of the story doesn't lie in Marcus's moment of downfall, nor even in his redemption, but in how one act of compassion from an experienced mentor planted seeds that continue to bloom in classrooms across the country, reminding us that our shared humanity is always stronger than our superficial differences. As Tuberville wrote in the dedication of his book, "To Marcus Williams, who taught me that the best teachers are those brave enough to also be students." And to all the children who are still learning that different doesn't mean lesser, the lesson endures. In a world that often encourages us to judge quickly and defend positions, sometimes the greatest strength lies in stopping, listening, and being willing to change our perspective. It's a lesson that continues to echo in classrooms, homes, and hearts, one transformative conversation at a time. Epilogue. Ripples across America. 10 years later, Harvard University, Cambridge, Massachusetts. Dr. Marcus Williams stood before a packed auditorium at Harvard's Graduate School of Education, the same institution where his father had earned his doctorate decades earlier. But today, Marcus wasn't just another visiting lecturer. He was being honored with the prestigious Horace Mann Award for excellence in educational leadership. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, back in his hometown, receiving one of education's highest honors for work that began with one of his most shameful moments. The bronze plaque in his hands read, "For pioneering research in cultural competency and transformative educational practices that have revolutionized how we address diversity in American classrooms." In the audience, his parents beamed with pride. His father, Dr. Robert Williams, had tears in his eyes as he watched his son, the same boy who had once mocked Southern accents, now being celebrated for his work in cultural inclusion. "Ladies and gentlemen," announced the dean, Dr. Williams's Second Chances protocol has been implemented in over 2,200 schools across 32 states, reducing cultural bias incidents by 67% and improving academic outcomes for minority students by 34%. But perhaps most remarkably, his journey began with what he calls the worst mistake of his academic life. Marcus approached the podium, his voice steady and confident, carrying just the slightest hint of Southern inflection. A deliberate choice he'd made years ago to honor the place that had truly educated him. "Thank you for this incredible honor," he began. "But before I accept this award, I need to tell y'all about a man who couldn't be here tonight, but deserves much of the credit for any good this work has accomplished." He clicked a remote, and Tommy Tuberville's image appeared on the large screen behind him. Senator Tuberville is currently in Afghanistan, visiting troops as part of his work on the Armed Services Committee. But 10 years ago, in a small lecture hall in Auburn, Alabama, this man changed not just my life, but set in motion a transformation that would reach classrooms from California to Maine. The audience listened intently as Marcus recounted the story they'd all heard before, but with new details that had emerged over the years of reflection and research. What I've learned through a decade of studying this interaction is that transformative education happens not when we eliminate conflict, but when we handle it with wisdom and compassion. Senator Tuberville could have destroyed me that day. Instead, he chose to build me up, even as he corrected me. Meanwhile, in Kabul, Afghanistan's Senator Tommy Tuberville was indeed with American troops, but he was also watching the Harvard ceremony via satellite link on his tablet. Sitting in a small communications tent at Bagram Air Base, he smiled as he watched Marcus accept the award. "Senator, you've got that proud papa look again," joked Colonel Maria Santos, the base commander who had been briefing him on educational programs for military families. "That young man there," Tuberville said, pointing to the screen, "taught me as much as I taught him, maybe more." Colonel Santos leaned in to watch. "Is this the famous Auburn video? My daughter's teacher showed that to her class last year. Made quite an impression." Tuberville nodded. "You know, Maria, I've been thinking a lot about leadership during this trip. Watching our young soldiers here, seeing their dedication despite coming from every corner of America, different accents, different backgrounds, all united in purpose. It reminds me why that moment with Marcus was so important." He paused the video on Marcus's face as he spoke to the Harvard audience. "Leadership isn't about making people conform to your way of speaking or thinking. It's about helping them become the best version of who they already are." 6 months later, Restoration Academy, New Orleans, Louisiana. The school had been rebuilt after Hurricane Katrina, but the real restoration was happening in the classrooms where Marcus's protocols were being implemented. Principal Janet Thibodeau, a New Orleans native with a thick Cajun accent, was leading a group of visiting educators through the hallways. "What makes our program unique," she explained in her distinctive Louisiana drawl, "is that we don't just tolerate differences, we celebrate them as educational assets." The group stopped outside a 5th grade classroom where teacher Ms. Evangeline Boudreau was conducting a lesson. Inside, students from various backgrounds, Creole, Vietnamese, Hispanic, African American, and white, were presenting projects about their family histories. "My great-grandmother spoke only French," explained young Pierre Tran, his Vietnamese-American accent mixing beautifully with Louisiana inflections. "But she taught my mom to cook, and through cooking she taught her about love and family." The visiting educators watched in amazement as each child's story was received with genuine interest and respect by their classmates. There were no snickers about accents, no rolled eyes at different ways of speaking. "This is what the Williams Protocol teaches us," Principal Thibodeau continued. "Every voice in our classroom carries wisdom. Our job is to help our students hear it." Dr. Susan Chen, the visiting superintendent from San Francisco and daughter of David Chen, Tuberville's childhood friend, raised her hand. "How do you train teachers to implement this effectively? It seems to require a fundamental shift in mindset." Principal Thibodeau smiled. "We start with the Auburn video, just like Dr. Williams recommends. But then we do something special. We pair each new teacher with a mentor from a different cultural background. They spend a month in each other's communities, experiencing what it feels like to be the outsider." 2 years later, Standing Rock Reservation, North Dakota teacher Joseph Crow Feather was preparing his middle school students for their annual presentation to visiting educators. The reservation school had struggled for years with low test scores and high dropout rates until they implemented the Second Chances protocol 3 years earlier. "Remember," Joseph told his students, "your voices matter, your stories matter. Your way of speaking carries the wisdom of our ancestors." 12-year-old Sarah Standing Bear raised her hand. "Mr. Crow Feather, my cousin at the school in Bismarck, said her teacher tells them to speak proper English." "And does that mean we're wrong?" Joseph smiled gently. "What do you think, Sarah? Is there only one way to be smart?" "No," she replied confidently. "My grandmother speaks 3 languages, Lakota, English, and Sign Language. She's the smartest person I know." "Exactly. And tomorrow, when those educators visit, I want you all to show them just how smart and capable you are, speaking exactly the way you speak." The next day, the visiting team was stunned by the presentations. Students spoke with confidence about complex topics, environmental science, mathematics, literature, their Native American inflections adding richness and authenticity to their presentations. Dr. Rachel Martinez, the state education supervisor, pulled Joseph aside afterward. "These test scores, they're remarkable. What changed?" Joseph gestured toward his students, who were confidently interacting with the adult visitors. "We stopped trying to make them sound like someone else and started helping them express who they really are. Turns out, when you stop wasting energy on code switching and start focusing on content, amazing things happen." Present day, the Tuberville Williams Institute, Auburn University. The newly constructed building stood as a testament to how far the original moment had traveled. Funded by donations from across the country, the Institute for Cultural Competency in Education had become a premier research center, welcoming educators from around the world. Dr. Jessica Morrison, Marcus's former classmate who had witnessed the original incident, now served as the Institute's director. She stood in the main conference room, preparing for the annual symposium that brought together educators, researchers, and policymakers. 10 years ago, she told the assembled crowd, I watched a moment of conflict transform into a moment of grace in this very building. Today, that moment has influenced educational policy in 47 states and 12 countries. The audience included teachers from rural Appalachian schools, urban districts in Los Angeles, tribal schools in Alaska, and international educators from countries as diverse as Australia, South Africa, and Finland. But the most remarkable thing, Jessica continued, isn't the widespread adoption of these practices. It's how they've created a ripple effect, inspiring countless other innovations in inclusive education. She clicked to a slide showing statistics. Schools implementing the Second Chances Protocol report not just improved academic outcomes, but reduced bullying by 45%, increased parent engagement by 58%, and improved teacher retention by 41%. Dr. Amira Hassan, visiting from Cairo University, raised her hand. Dr. Morrison, how do you adapt these principles for international contexts where the cultural dynamics are different? That's the beauty of what Senator Tuberville and Dr. Williams discovered, Jessica replied. The core principle, listening beyond surface differences to hear the humanity and intelligence beneath, that's universal. The specific applications change, but the heart remains the same. That evening, Marcus's home in Auburn, Marcus sat on his back porch, grading papers from his graduate course on cultural competency and educational leadership. His wife, Sarah, a former student from his early teaching days, was inside putting their 2 young children to bed. His phone buzzed with a text from Tommy Tuberville. Watched the Institute Symposium online today. Proud of you, son. Amazing how far we've come from that September morning. Marcus smiled and texted back, couldn't have done it without the best teacher I ever had. Thank you for seeing potential instead of just a problem. The reply came quickly. Thank you for having the courage to grow. That's what real education is about. Marcus set down his phone and looked out at the Auburn campus in the distance. Somewhere in those buildings, new students were arriving every day, carrying their own accents, their own backgrounds, their own stories. And thanks to the protocols now embedded in the university's teacher preparation program, they would be met by educators trained to see those differences as assets rather than obstacles. 6 months later, the White House, Washington, D.C. President Catherine Walsh stood at the podium in the East Room, announcing the launch of the National Initiative for Cultural Competency in Education. Behind her sat a diverse panel, including Marcus, Tommy Tuberville, and educators from across the country. The Tuberville-Williams Protocol, the president announced, will become the foundation for a new federal program supporting cultural competency training in all schools receiving federal funding. Because in America, our diversity isn't our weakness, it's our greatest strength. Marcus felt a surreal sense of completion as he listened to the president speak. 10 years ago, he had been an arrogant graduate student who thought intelligence could be measured by accent. Now, his work was being implemented at the highest levels of government. During the reception afterward, he found himself in conversation with Secretary of Education, Dr. Michelle Roberts, herself a product of rural Mississippi schools. "Dr. Williams," she said, "I want you to know that your work saved my nephew's academic career. He was struggling in a Seattle school where teachers constantly corrected his Southern accent. After his school implemented your protocol, everything changed." Marcus felt tears welling up. That's all Senator Tuberville and I ever wanted, for every child to feel valued for who they are. 1 year later, International Conference on Educational Equity, Geneva, Switzerland, the United Nations, Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, was hosting its largest conference on educational equity in decades. Educators from 195 countries had gathered to share best practices for inclusive education. Tommy Tuberville, now retired from the Senate and serving as a special ambassador for educational initiatives, stood before the International Assembly. "Colleagues from around the world," he began, his Alabama accent carrying clearly through the translation systems, "I want to tell you all about a lesson I learned from a student who taught me that sometimes our greatest teachers come from our greatest mistakes." The familiar story unfolded, but this time with global context. Tuberville spoke about how the principles discovered in that Auburn classroom had been adapted for Aboriginal students in Australia, immigrant children in Germany, and rural students in Kenya. "Education isn't about erasing who our children are," he concluded. "It's about helping them become the fullest expression of their authentic selves." The standing ovation lasted for several minutes, with delegates from every continent rising to honor not just the message, but the messenger who had learned to see his own accent not as a limitation, but as a bridge to understanding others. Final scene, Auburn University, present day. On a warm September morning, 15 years after the original incident, a new group of education students filed into the same lecture hall where it all began. The room had been renovated and expanded, but the essential character remained the same. Dr. Marcus Williams, now a full professor and endowed chair, stood at the same podium where Tommy Tuberville had once taught him the most important lesson of his life. Behind him, a plaque read, "The Tuberville-Williams Center for Transformative Education, where every voice matters." "Welcome to Educational Leadership 101, Marcus began, his voice carrying the confidence that comes from years of successful teaching and the humility that comes from never forgetting where that success began. In the third row, almost exactly where Marcus had sat years before, a young woman named Ashley Chen, David Chen's daughter, listened intently. She was pursuing her master's degree in education, having been inspired by the stories her father told about friendship transcending cultural differences. "Before we begin our semester together," Marcus continued, "I want to share a story about the most important lesson I ever learned about education. It happened right here in this room, and it started with one of the biggest mistakes I ever made." He clicked his remote, and the now famous video began to play. But this time, it wasn't just a teaching tool. It was a living reminder that every moment holds the potential for transformation. Every mistake holds the seed of wisdom, and every difference holds the possibility of connection. As the video played, showing a younger, more arrogant Marcus standing to face his prejudices, the current Marcus watched his students' faces. He saw the recognition, the discomfort, the dawning understanding that would hopefully prevent them from making similar mistakes. And in that moment, he understood that this was the true legacy of that September morning 15 years ago. Not just the programs implemented or the awards received, but the continuing cycle of teaching and learning, of falling down and getting back up, of building bridges where others might build walls. The lesson had indeed endured, rippling outward in ways that Tommy Tuberville could never have imagined when he chose compassion over condemnation, and that Marcus could never have foreseen when he chose growth over defensiveness. In classrooms across America and around the world, teachers were learning to listen beyond accents to hear intelligence, beyond differences to find commonality, beyond first impressions to discover the full humanity of every student who walked through their doors. And somewhere in Alabama, in a small rural school, not unlike the ones where both Tuberville and Marcus had learned their earliest lessons about life, a young teacher was about to show the famous video to her class, continuing the cycle one more time, proving that the best lessons never really end. They just find new voices to carry them forward. The accent that had once divided had become the voice that united, and the moment of shame had transformed into a legacy of hope that would echo through generations of students yet to come. Extended legacy. The continuing story. 20 years later, Marcus Williams Elementary School, Birmingham, Alabama. The ribbon-cutting ceremony for the newly constructed school drew hundreds of community members, educators, and dignitaries. The building itself was a marvel of inclusive design, classrooms built with acoustics that enhanced rather than distorted various accents, walls decorated with artwork celebrating cultural diversity, and a central atrium featuring quotes in dozens of languages spoken by students and families in the district. Mayor Jonathan Davis, himself a product of Birmingham's public schools, stepped to the microphone. "Today, we dedicate not just a building, but a living testament to the power of transformative education. Marcus Williams Elementary School will serve students from over 30 different cultural backgrounds, and thanks to the principles established right here in Alabama 2 decades ago, every one of those students will be celebrated for exactly who they are." In the audience, a now graying doctor, Marcus Williams sat with his family, watching his teenage daughter Emma document the ceremony on her phone for the school's social media accounts. His son Michael, a high school senior, had been accepted to Auburn University with plans to study education. Following in his father's footsteps, but armed with wisdom that had taken Marcus years to acquire. "Dad," Emma whispered, "do you ever think about what would have happened if Senator Tuberville hadn't been so kind that day?" Marcus considered the question seriously. "Every day, sweetheart. I think about all the students I might have failed to reach, all the potential I might have missed. It reminds me why we can never stop learning and growing." Tommy Tuberville, now 73 but still vigorous, rose to speak. His hair was completely white, but his voice carried the same strength and warmth that had commanded respect in locker rooms and lecture halls for decades. "Friends," he began, his accent as pronounced as ever, 20 years ago, a young man taught me something I thought I already knew, that our greatest failures can become our greatest teachers if we have the courage to learn from them." He gestured toward the school building behind him. "This school will serve children whose first language might be Spanish, Vietnamese, Arabic, or Lakota, children whose families fled war zones, and children whose roots go back generations in Alabama soil. And every one of them will learn that their voice matters, their story has value, and their way of speaking carries the wisdom of their heritage." That same day, University of Alabama, Tuscaloosa Dr. Sarah Williams Chen, No relation to David Chen, despite the coincidental name. Marcus's former student and now a leading researcher in neurolinguistics, was presenting her groundbreaking study to an international conference via video link. Our 20-year longitudinal study, following students who experienced cultural competency education, shows remarkable results, she explained to the virtual audience of over 2,000 educators worldwide. Not only do these students show improved academic outcomes, but they demonstrate significantly higher levels of empathy, creative problem solving, and what we call cognitive flexibility, the ability to adapt their thinking to new situations. The data on her screen was compelling. Students from schools implementing the Tuberville-Williams protocol scored 23% higher on creative thinking assessments, showed 31% better cross-cultural communication skills, and were 45% more likely to pursue careers in fields requiring international collaboration. But perhaps most significantly, Dr. Williams-Chen continued, these students report feeling more confident in their own identities while simultaneously being more accepting of others. They've learned that strength comes not from conformity, but from authentic self-expression combined with genuine respect for diversity. Meanwhile, Silicon Valley, California. At Google's Mountain View headquarters, David Chen, now a senior vice president, was hosting a company-wide meeting on diversity and inclusion. At 67, he had become one of the tech industry's most respected voices on creating inclusive workplace cultures. "I want to share a story," he told the assembled employees, both in person and virtual, "about a lesson I learned when I was 8 years old that has shaped every decision I've made as a leader." The familiar tale of the Connecticut playground unfolded, but with new context about how that early experience of finding an ally had influenced his approach to building teams where everyone's voice was valued. "Tommy Tuberville taught me that standing up for others who are different isn't just the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do, because diverse perspectives lead to better solutions, and inclusive cultures attract the best talent." He clicked to a slide showing Google's latest diversity statistics. Today, our engineering teams include people from 47 different countries speaking 23 different languages as their first language. And our most innovative projects consistently come from our most diverse teams. In the audience, young software engineer Priya Patel raised her hand. "Mr. Chen, how do you maintain that inclusive culture as the company grows? It seems like it would be easy to lose that personal touch." David smiled. "Great question, Priya. We use what we call the Auburn Principle, named after the university where Senator Tuberville's famous lecture took place. Every manager receives training on recognizing and valuing different communication styles, and we've built bias interruption into all our review processes." 6 months later, the Rural Schools Initiative, Appalachian Mountains, West Virginia. Teacher Maria Santos stood in front of her one-room schoolhouse, serving students from grades K-8 in the coal mining community of Beckley Hollow. The building was old, the resources limited, but the implementation of cultural competency principles had transformed the educational experience for her 23 students. "Y'all remember what we learned about different ways of being smart?" she asked her mixed-age class. 8-year-old Billy Joe raised his hand enthusiastically. "Different don't mean worse, Miss Maria. My granddaddy can't read books real good, but he can read the weather and the mountains better than anybody." "That's exactly right, Billy Joe. And Sarah, what did we learn about accents?" 12-year-old Sarah Mackenzie stood up proudly. "Our mountain way of talking carries the history of our people. It's not something to be ashamed of, it's something to be proud of." Maria beamed. These children, whose families had been marginalized for generations due to stereotypes about Appalachian culture, were now growing up with unshakable confidence in their own worth and abilities. The transformation had been dramatic, Before implementing the protocol 3 years earlier, her students had been reluctant to speak in class, especially when outsiders visited. Now they eagerly shared their knowledge about local ecology, family traditions, and mountain wisdom with visiting educators and researchers. "Miss Maria," asked 10-year-old James, "when those college people come next week, can I tell them about how my daddy can find water underground just by watching the land?" "Absolutely, James. That's exactly the kind of knowledge that makes our community special and valuable." 1 year later, International Space Station Commander Lisa Rodriguez, floating in the cupola of the International Space Station, was conducting a live educational broadcast to schools around the world. Her crew included astronauts from the United States, Russia, Japan, and Nigeria, creating a perfect laboratory for cultural collaboration. "Students, I want to tell you about something amazing that happens up here," she said, Earth slowly rotating behind her. "When we work together on complex problems, we each bring different ways of thinking, different languages, different approaches. And those differences don't make our work harder, they make it better." She gestured to her crewmate, Dr. Genji Tanaka. Dr. Tanaka approaches problems with a methodical precision that reflects his Japanese engineering training. Commander Volkov brings a Russian perspective on systems thinking that often catches problems the rest of us miss. Dr. Adebayo's Nigerian background gives her insights into resource conservation that have improved our efficiency. In classrooms around the world, students watched in fascination as the crew demonstrated how their different approaches to the same problem led to more innovative solutions. "The lesson," Commander Rodriguez continued, "is that diversity isn't just nice to have, it's essential for solving complex challenges. Whether you're exploring space or tackling problems here on Earth, you need teams that think differently." Back in Auburn, Alabama, Marcus Williams watched the broadcast with his own students, many of whom were now pursuing STEM careers, specifically because they had learned to see their diverse backgrounds as assets rather than obstacles. Present day, the Marcus Williams Institute for Educational Excellence, Atlanta, Georgia. The gleaming new research facility represented the culmination of 2 decades of work, translating the Auburn moment into scalable educational practices. Dr. Marcus Williams, now 42 and one of the most influential voices in American education, stood before a gathering of international education ministers. "Excellence in education," he told the assembled leaders, "isn't about creating uniformity. It's about creating conditions where every learner can achieve their highest potential while maintaining their authentic identity." Education Minister Chen Wei from Singapore raised her hand. "Dr. Williams, how do you measure success in such a system? Traditional metrics focus on standardization." Marcus smiled, recognizing the ongoing challenge. "That's the paradigm shift we're advocating for. Instead of measuring how well students conform to a single standard, we measure how effectively they can demonstrate mastery in ways that honor their strengths and cultural assets." He clicked to a slide showing comparative data. "Students in schools using our assessment protocols show equivalent or superior academic achievement compared to traditional methods, but with dramatically improved social-emotional outcomes and post-graduation success rates." The data was compelling, but Marcus knew the real measure of success wasn't in statistics. It was in the thousands of students who now walked through the world with confidence in their own worth and respect for others' differences. That evening, Tuberville Family Ranch, Auburn, Alabama, Senator Tommy Tuberville, retired, sat on his porch with his grandson, Tommy III, reviewing the boys' college application essays. At 15, Tommy III was already showing the leadership qualities that had made his grandfather famous, but with an added layer of cultural sensitivity that reflected the changed world he was growing up in. "Granddaddy," the young man said, "I want to write my application essay about that day with Mr. Williams." "Is that okay?" Tommy Tuberville smiled, remembering the shy 8-year-old boy who had once been ashamed of his accent. "Of course, son. But tell me, what's your angle? What's the lesson you want to share?" Tommy III thought carefully. "I want to write about how courage isn't just about standing up for yourself. It's about standing up for the right thing, even when it's hard. You could have embarrassed Mr. Williams that day, but you chose to teach instead. That took courage." The older man felt pride swell in his chest. "And what about Marcus? What kind of courage did he show?" "The hardest kind," Tommy III replied without hesitation. "The courage to admit you're wrong and change. Most people would rather defend a mistake than fix it." As the sun set over the Alabama countryside, grandfather and grandson sat in comfortable silence, both understanding that the lesson from that September morning 20 years earlier was still teaching, still growing, still transforming lives in ways they were only beginning to understand. Final scene: Auburn University, the Tommy Tuberville Leadership Center. On the 20th anniversary of the original incident, Auburn University hosted a special symposium bringing together educators, researchers, and policymakers from around the world. The newly dedicated Leadership Center bore Tuberville's name, but its mission reflected the collaborative spirit that had emerged from that transformative moment. Dr. Marcus Williams stood at the podium in the main auditorium, looking out at an audience that included former students, current educators, and future leaders. In the front row sat Tommy Tuberville, now using a walking cane, but still commanding respect with his presence. 20 years ago, Marcus began, I stood in a classroom not far from here and made one of the worst mistakes of my life. I judged a man's intelligence by his accent, and in doing so, revealed the poverty of my own understanding. The audience listened intently, many hearing the story for the first time, despite its widespread fame. But Senator Tuberville saw something in that moment that I couldn't see, an opportunity for teaching rather than punishment, for growth rather than shame. He could have destroyed me. Instead, he chose to build me up. Marcus paused, looking directly at his mentor. That choice didn't just change my life. It set in motion a transformation that has touched millions of students, thousands of teachers, and hundreds of schools across the globe. The statistics were staggering. The Tuberville-Williams Protocol had been implemented in 47 countries, translated into 31 languages, and was credited with improving educational outcomes for over 2.3 million students worldwide. But the real measure of our success, Marcus continued, isn't in the numbers. It's in the young person who speaks up in class because they know their voice matters. It's in the teacher who sees potential instead of problems. It's in the parent who feels welcomed in their child's school, regardless of how they speak or where they come from. As applause filled the auditorium, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. From an arrogant graduate student to an internationally recognized leader in educational excellence, from someone who mocked differences to someone who celebrated them as strengths. Tommy Tuberville rose slowly to his feet, his standing ovation joined by every person in the room. But he wasn't applauding just Marcus, he was applauding the power of transformation itself, the possibility that any moment, no matter how difficult or uncomfortable, could become a catalyst for positive change. The lesson that had begun with an accent had become a movement. The moment of shame had transformed into a legacy of hope. And somewhere in America, in classrooms from sea to shining sea, teachers were learning to listen not just to what their students said, but to who they were. And in that listening, they were discovering that every voice, in all its beautiful diversity, had something valuable to teach. The accent that had once divided had indeed become the voice that united, proving that sometimes our greatest teachers come disguised as our greatest challenges, and our most powerful lessons emerge from our willingness to transform our worst moments into our best selves.